Howdy campers! Summer may almost be over, but there's still plenty of time for all your favorite activities this fine Friday the 13th weekend. Archery, swimming, underage drinking, craft making, recreational drug use, go-karts, and of course, brutal and agonizing death at the hands of a vengeful mother and her hockey enthusiast son. Here's the complete abridged history of Friday the 13th. This is Nerdist Now. Friday the 13th is one of the most iconic horror franchises in film history. Not only did it dominate the box office during the slasher movie craze of the 1980s, but its main antagonist, Jason Voorhees, has gone on to become as ingrained in popular culture as Frankenstein or Dracula. It's been over 40 years since the world was first introduced to Camp Crystal Lake and its terrifying resident slasher. And over the course of 12 movies, Jason Voorhees and his mother have crafted quite the legacy that still persists with fans to this day. So, in honor of this highest of horror holidays, let's take a look back at the history of Friday the 13th.
Good to Camp Blood, ain't ya?
Let's dive in with a trip back to where it all began, 1980s Friday the 13th. The first film in the series revolves around a relatively simple plot about a group of teenagers working to get the infamous Camp Crystal Lake ready to reopen after a series of murders that took place there several years earlier. One aspect that's unique to the original that we don't really see in later installments is that there's also a bit of a murder mystery element with the killer, as their identity is kept hidden until the very end. As the counselors break off into groups and begin engaging in debaucherous activities like strip Monopoly, a mysterious killer begins slowly picking them off one by one until only Alice, played by Adrienne King, remains. It is then that we arrive at a shocking twist as Alice comes face to face with the true killer, who is revealed to be
Jason!
Not so fast, Drew Barrymore. As anyone who's seen Scream already knows, it was actually Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, who was the original killer. 40-year-old spoiler, but her son Jason drowned in the lake back in 1957 because the counselors were off canoodling and not paying enough attention. So the following year, Mrs. Voorhees exacted her revenge, and the camp shut down. When it looked like a new owner was preparing to reopen it back up again, Mama Voorhees was once more driven to enact her bloody vengeance on those who would dare return to Camp Blood. The film concludes with an intense brawl between Alice and Mrs. Voorhees, with Alice chopping off Mrs. Voorhees' head with a machete. Alice then climbs into a canoe and drifts off into the lake until help arrives the next morning. It is then that we are treated to one of the most iconic jump scares in horror history when a grimy and deformed Jason bursts out of the lake behind her and drags her in. Alice wakes up in the hospital hysterical over what happened, but is told that there was no boy in the lake, and the movie ends with the ominous line,
Then he's still there.
While largely panned by critics, the slasher film struck a chord with audiences and was an instant hit. Made on a shoestring budget of only $550,000, the movie would go on to earn almost $60 million at the box office, and a new horror franchise was born. Though there are certainly many contributing factors to the film's success, two of the biggest appeals of the movie were easily the work of special effects wizard Tom Savini and the now iconic score by composer Harry Manfredini. Both of these elements helped to define the early trademarks of the series and elevated Friday the 13th from just another horror film to a classic of the genre. Friday the 13th Part 2. In the first sequel of the series, Friday the 13th Part 2, the creative team was met with a bit of a challenge. With Mrs. Voorhees pretty unambiguously dead after a terminal case of decapitation, it would seem that the best option would be to shift focus to her son Jason to carry on the torch of killer in the family. But wait. Wasn't he dead in the original? Sure, he popped up out of the lake at the end for one final scare, but that was just a dream. The version of Jason we catch up with in Part 2 isn't even a little boy like we saw previously, but a grown-ass adult with a full head of hair. It makes a hot mess of the canon, but essentially the sequel rewrites Jason's origin so that he now actually survived his supposed drowning at Crystal Lake all those years ago and went on to live alone in the woods around the lake. Then, seeing his mother's death sends him on a new path of murderous revenge. Part 2 follows a similar plot as the original, with another group of teenagers working to reopen the camp. The sequel also kills off Alice early on in the opening scene of the movie, severing the biggest loose thread from the original. The new final girl, Ginny, played by Amy Steele, serves as an excellent foil to the masked killer. After the rest of the campers have been killed off, Ginny finds herself inside Jason's cabin, where she discovers a disturbing shrine to his dead mother, complete with severed head and matching sweater. She manages to outsmart Jason by putting on the sweater and pretending to be the dearly departed Mrs. Voorhees long enough to take him down. We are ultimately left once more with a shocking ending in which an unmasked Jason bursts through a window to grab Jenny and provide one final scare. Friday the 13th Part 3D. Friday the 13th moved forward with a third entry in the series, this time taking things into a new dimension. Friday the 13th Part 3 is a wonderful gem of 80s horror and is easily one of the most beloved in the series. Not only do we get some magnificent old school 3D cinematography, but the score is a wonderfully funky, disco-infused mix of the original that is simply the best. The story changes things up and infuses a bit more humor into the writing as well. 3D is also a noteworthy mark in the franchise, as it's the film that finally put Jason in his iconic hockey mask. In fact, we see Jason's whole look overall refined to be more in line with what we will see for the rest of the series. After hacking and slashing his way through a fresh batch of teenagers and a gang of bikers, Jason faces off against a new final girl, Chris, played by Dana Kimmel, who we learned through flashbacks has come face to face with Jason in the past. This time, she ultimately succeeds in taking him down and survives the ordeal, only to experience a dream sequence which inverts the original film, seeing a zombified Mrs. Voorhees popping out of the lake to end the movie. Don't ask. Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Part 3 was intended to be the final film in the series, but it went on to be the most financially successful entry yet. Logically, a fourth installment was announced. However, by this point in the 80s, there was a growing cultural backlash to the slasher subgenre that made producers and studios uneasy. Films like Silent Night, Deadly Night stirred up concerned parents whose children were seeing trailers for the film on television and were horrified by Santa's new naughty list policy. This movement put a bigger target on Jason, and it was ultimately decided that Part 4 was going to be the last, appropriately dubbing it the final chapter. The death of Jason Voorhees would involve two key players, the return of Tom Savini for the special effects, and a young lead who would deal the final blow, Corey Feldman as Tommy Jarvis. The production team set out to make this the biggest and bloodiest Friday yet and send the series out with a bang. After taking out a new group of teenagers in creative fashion, Jason finally got a taste of his own medicine. After shaving his head to look like and confuse the killer, Tommy whacks away at Jason's head with a machete, with one final blow sticking in the side of his head as Jason slides down in one of the most iconic shots of the series. Despite it being the final chapter, the filmmakers couldn't help but conclude the film with at least somewhat of a wink to the audience. Tommy arrives at the hospital to see his sister, and everything seems fine, until we see one final look from Tommy implying something sinister may have been awoken within him. The image is an impactful one and seemed to hint at where the series would be heading. Kinda. Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. The final chapter was sincerely intended to be the end of the series, but like Jason himself, the franchise didn't take long to rise from the grave. Christened A New Beginning, the fifth entry picks up years after the events of the final chapter and continues the story of Tommy Jarvis, now older and struggling with the trauma that he experienced as a child. Set at a secluded halfway house for troubled teens, things quickly unravel after one of the patients is killed and more murders soon follow. A New Beginning attempts to play up somewhat of a murder mystery story similar to the original, but it also makes sure to incorporate the imagery of Jason into the narrative as well. Ultimately, we discover it is not the real Jason at all, but rather an imposter. The killer is revealed to be the ambulance driver seen at the beginning of the movie, and the first person killed early on by another patient was actually his son. Seeing his boy chopped up over a candy bar set him off, and he decided to use the Jason legacy to exact his revenge. And he would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for those meddling kids. The whole movie has a bit of a Scooby-Doo vibe, which left many fans feeling cheated that Jason wasn't really in the movie. You can definitely see what the filmmakers were attempting to do with the evolution of Tommy's character, especially with how the movie ends, setting him up as the next Jason once again. The backlash from fans was hard to ignore despite the film's positive financial performance, and it didn't take long for the franchise to change course and quickly make plans to resurrect Jason. Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. Tommy takes center stage again, largely ignoring the events of Part 5, and serves as the catalyst for Jason's return as well as his demise. The film finds Tommy, now distinctly a protagonist with no evil tendencies, seeking out Jason's grave, unconvinced of his death. While attempting to exact further revenge on the killer by stabbing him a few times with an iron fence rod for good measure, Jason ends up getting struck by lightning, bringing him back to life a la Frankenstein's monster, and hijinks ensue. To me, the film marks a turning point in the series. While Jason's return in the earlier entries may have seemed a bit far-fetched, there was never anything explicitly supernatural about the character either. In Part 6 and onward, the series shifts to a far less grounded style of storytelling. No longer is Jason merely a deranged killer, he is now an undead zombie. Jason Lives also takes a distinctly more tongue-in-cheek approach to the tone and humor as well. The movies aren't quite as self-serious as they once were, and by this point in the 80s, the filmmakers knew exactly what sort of movie they were making and intended to have fun with it.
Does he think I'm a farthead?
Look no further than the James Bond-style opening titles and the official song for the film, recorded by Alice Cooper, complete with a gloriously 80s music video. This was part of a bizarre yet incredible trend in horror movies at the time that I wish would make a comeback. See also Dawkins' Dream Warriors for Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and the Ramones' Pet Sematary for Pet Sematary. The film ends with Tommy confronting his mortal enemy Jason, this time on the waters of Crystal Lake, or Lake Forest Green as the locals have renamed it in this movie. With Jason now an undead force of nature, a more creative solution had to be taken with how to stop him. Ultimately, Tommy manages to put a chain noose around Jason's neck and sends him to the bottom of the lake with the help of a large boulder. Of course, a final shot of Jason's eye opening signaled to audiences that he'd be back. Despite the positive response for the film, Part 6 underperformed below all of its predecessors at the box office, with many citing the lingering backlash to the previous film as the cause rather than the quality of the film itself. Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. The New Blood continued the more supernatural direction of the series. With Tommy Jarvis's story now complete, Jason is this time pitted against a new protagonist, Tina, a girl with telekinetic powers similar to Stephen King's Carrie. Traumatized as a child after using her powers to accidentally kill her father at Crystal Lake, Tina returns as a teenager and mistakenly frees Jason from his underwater prison, thinking him to be her deceased dad. The film is a fun, self-aware ride filled with sex, violence, and humor. Tina also serves as an interesting opponent to Jason, who is now essentially superhuman, as the climax involves the pair squaring off like two forces of nature. The ending is admittedly a little strange, with Tina summoning her dead father from the pits of Crystal Lake to drag Jason back down with him. Part 7 is probably most notable for the beginning of the Kane Hodder era of Jason. While there had been many stuntmen to take on the role in the past, Hodder is the only person to play the part across multiple films and immediately stood out as a fan favorite for his iconic turn as the masked killer. It may seem like a simple enough job to play someone whose only real defining characteristics are hockey mask and killing people, but Kane Hodder incorporated many aspects to the character's movement and demeanor that provided distinct layers of nuance to his performance and made the role his own. Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. After 7 films set at Camp Crystal Lake, the idea came about to move Jason into a new environment, namely New York City, and so Part 8 was dubbed Jason Takes Manhattan. However, anyone who has actually seen the movie will be quick to point out the somewhat misleading nature of the title. Despite all marketing materials really pushing the legitimately compelling idea of Jason terrorizing the Big Apple, the majority of the film actually takes place on a cruise ship full of high school graduates on their way to New York. And before you ask, no, it makes absolutely no sense how the cruise ship gets from Crystal Lake to the Atlantic Ocean. But don't worry, nothing about this film makes sense. In reality, only a small chunk of the film's ending actually takes place in the city itself, which understandably left audiences once more feeling disappointed and misled. It was also filmed in Vancouver. The film added even further confusion to the Jason canon with the backstory of the film's protagonist, Rennie, who we see in a flashback coming face to face with a young Jason in the waters of Crystal Lake while almost drowning as a girl, which makes absolutely no sense given the timeline of the films, but also... After punching off heads and dipping guys in barrels of toxic waste, Jason is killed by Rennie with toxic sewage water. Nothing about it makes sense, and unfortunately, Part 8 would prove to hit an all-time low for the series, seeing both harsh negative criticism and record low box office returns. It had seemed as though Jason had finally met his match. Jason Goes to Hell. With producer Frank Mancuso Jr.'s departure and the poor performance of Part 8, Jason and the Friday the 13th franchise would stay dead for 3 years, until original creator Sean S. Cunningham decided to resurrect his creation once more, inspired by the desire to bring the long-rumored Freddy vs. Jason film to life. While it would still take several years before the two icons would face off, Cunningham did manage to secure the sequel rights from Paramount Pictures, who had produced the first 8 films, and struck a deal with New Line Cinema, who owned the rights to Freddy Krueger. Cunningham couldn't legally use the title Friday the 13th, but he and New Line Cinema did have the rights to the character of Jason, and set out to make another sequel, this time titled Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. The film was a large departure from the Paramount run in almost every way. With Jason's character killed off in the opening scene of the movie, the story did a massive overhaul of the series' mythology, now positioning Jason as a full-on demonic supernatural force. The rest of the movie sees the entity of Jason hopping from body to body until he's reborn as his former self due to some complicated mythology involving his half-sister and her family. In the end, Jason is defeated with a magical dagger and dragged into hell in fantastical fashion. The film is kind of the black sheep of the franchise. Like, even more than Part 5. While you can certainly appreciate that the filmmakers were attempting to try something bold and different with the sequel, Jason Goes to Hell stands as an extremely divisive entry among fans. At least it ended with an awesome cliffhanger of Freddy's glove reaching up and grabbing Jason's mask. That means we're finally getting Freddy vs. Jason, right? Right? Jason X. Despite Jason Goes to Hell's ending, Freddy vs. Jason was still another 10 years away. While the project sat in development hell throughout the rest of the 90s, it was eventually decided, why not make another Jason movie in the meantime? And with that, Jason entered the final frontier of horror. Dubbed Jason X, the 10th film in the franchise launched Jason into space and the future with a movie that is admittedly not as bad as you might think. After being captured and frozen by the government, with a fun cameo by David Cronenberg, Jason is eventually discovered by a group of futuristic science students excavating the ruins of Earth some 400 years in the future. Unaware of what they have uncovered, they bring Jason back aboard their spaceship and unfreeze him, which is just a super smart thing to do. After meeting his match with an android character who blows him to pieces, Jason receives a cybernetic upgrade and becomes even more menacing than before. The survivors manage to blow Jason out into space, where he promptly falls down to Earth 2 and burns up in the planet's atmosphere. Unlike its predecessor, Jason X seemed to resonate more with what fans loved about the original films. Yet, after being shelved for multiple years and leaked online in the interim, by the time the film finally released in 2001, it was a box office bomb. In the years since, the film has gone on to grow more of a cult following among the fan base. Story aside, it does feature some of the most iconic moments and kills from the franchise, including the liquid nitrogen face smash. And most importantly, good or bad, the film helped keep Jason alive in the cultural zeitgeist for what was coming next. Freddy vs. Jason. At long last, after years and years of hype and anticipation within the horror community, fans would finally get to see the two biggest slasher icons of the 80s square off. And how was it? Yeah, I'd be lying if I said the final result wasn't at least somewhat of a letdown. But after so much hype, how could it not be? The story centers around Freddy, who has faded into obscurity and is no longer feared among the teens of Springwood. Freddy hatches a plan to resurrect himself by unleashing Jason on the town so that people will think Freddy is back and thus restore his former power. Freddy soon learns that Jason cannot be controlled though, and decides that he has to take him down before there are no teenagers left for him to murder. The two titans clash multiple times in both the dream and real world before a climactic showdown at Crystal Lake. The movie ends with no clear winner, instead opting for a more ambiguous ending that allows fans of both franchises to draw their own conclusions. While there are some memorable moments, the film overall feels like something that had been in development for over a decade. As a result, the final product feels like less of a culmination of two successful franchises at the height of their prime, but more of a last-ditch effort to milk something out of two properties that had run out of gas. Many Friday fans were also upset by the exclusion of Kane Hodder from the film, who by this point was Jason to the majority of the fandom, and had instead been replaced by newcomer Ken Kersinger. Despite the divisive nature of the film among fans, it proved a massive hit at the box office. While there were talks of sequels, like Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash from Evil Dead, which was eventually turned into a comic book, nothing ever seemed to get off the ground. It seemed that, sadly, this was once again the end of the road for Jason. Friday the 13th. That is, of course, until the era of the horror reboot came along to offer Jason a truly new beginning. The 2009 version of Friday the 13th played as less of a direct retelling of any of the original films and more so as a remix of the original four. Opting to keep the focus on Jason, the movie relegates Mrs. Voorhees to a brief opening credit sequence in which we see her kappa get detated before a young Jason enters and takes up the mantle. The movie itself kind of feels like two parts. The first is a long pre-title sequence featuring a group of college students who go camping near Crystal Lake and run into a now adult Jason who is sporting a sack over his head like in part 2. The second involves Sam Winchester looking for his missing sister, who is part of the group from the opener. He encounters and becomes entangled with another group of college students on their way to stay at a cabin by the lake, and of course, hijinks ensue. The two stories do end up colliding as we learn that the sister character is in fact still alive due to the fact that she apparently holds a strong resemblance to Jason's mother. In the end, they manage to best Jason by catching him in some old farm equipment, but of course you can't get rid of him that easily, and the film ends with one final scare of Jason popping out of the lake and grabbing old Sammy. It's actually a quality update to the Friday the 13th series. It revitalized the character of Jason, played brilliantly by Derek Mears, and took the film back to a more serious tone audiences hadn't seen since the early years of the franchise. And, in my humble opinion, it stands as one of the best entries of the slasher remake era.
Take that damn thing off.
Unfortunately, a recent ongoing lawsuit between the original screenwriter Victor Miller and producer Sean S. Cunningham has put any hopes of another Friday film on indefinite hold for the time being. However, if there's one thing we've learned over the course of this historic franchise, it's that, like Jason himself, it never truly dies. So, in the meantime, tell us, what Friday the 13th film is your favorite? Which version of Jason do you like best? Do you remember the Friday the 13th TV show? Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, stay tuned to Nerdist.com. Happy Friday the 13th, everybody.